It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. Our guest today is the acclaimed historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and perhaps the most widely read scholar of the American presidency. She is the author of 6 best-selling books, most recently The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. Her biography of Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, was the basis for Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning film Lincoln. She was awarded the Pulitzer for No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Home Front in World War II. Her other books examine President Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. It's a pleasure, and we're lucky to get to have an hour of your time.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
The body of your work over the 6 books and 40 years of studying presidents and the presidency is monumental, obviously. But you have particularly focused on 3 of the most important and contentious times in American history. The Civil War, obviously, but then also this less understood, highly divided period at the beginning of the 20th century, and then, of course, the 1960s. Those were also each eras in which the role of African Americans in American life was on the table, and pivotal decisions about the role of African Americans. What is it from those 3 periods? What lessons might there be that we could draw that would be instructive today as we wrestle through a similarly divided time and one in which race is also now really at the center of it?
Well, when you think about the progress that was made through the Civil War and then again at the turn of the 20th century and especially in the 60s, social movements from the outside seem to be the key toward moving public opinion forward. The anti-slavery movement was there for decades, creating a mood that allowed finally people in the North to create the Republican Party and produce what eventually becomes the Emancipation. And the 60s, there's no question that the Civil Rights Movement was the engine from the outside that Lyndon Johnson was able then to connect to produce the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and fair housing and so much of the legislation in the 60s. So I think when we look today at so much of what's happening with racial tension, there's still, in my dream, a hope that a movement is out there rather than just scattered protests about individual problems, but that can really talk about what is that next stage in the racial relations that we need to, and it probably has to do with social and economic justice, which is where LBJ was going before the war in Vietnam cut it loose. The war overtook the momentum that was beginning to build for social and economic change, not just legal change with civil rights and voting rights. I mean, the speech that LBJ gave at Howard University talked about all the things we're talking about today, the inner city, the fact that there's little hope for people when you've got decaying housing and you've got bad education and family structure that's a problem. But then the war took that over. And then the civil rights movement itself lost some of its momentum. Martin Luther King was killed. And we've had some decades where we haven't focused directly on that problem anymore. So history tells you that when things seem intractable, though, we can make changes. I mean, that's why I love it so much. I mean, I think we're at a stage in the country in general, not just with racial relations, where we feel like our problems are so complicated we don't have power over them anymore, that there's not anything we can do as citizens. But everything I've learned in the progressive era, it was citizens that pushed Teddy Roosevelt and the reluctant Congress to do the legislation that was needed at the turn of the century. It was citizens that began the anti-slavery movement. It was citizens in the civil rights movement in the 60s. All my periods with my guys.
There is oftentimes a sense around history, both, and oftentimes even historians, I think, project this, but a sense of inevitability about history, that the things that happen were just going to happen, almost a sense of predestination, as opposed to what your books really do capture is that these are human beings with all sorts of frailties, and they make good decisions and bad decisions.
FDR once said, problems created by men can be solved by men. You know, we sometimes think that things are either predestined or too messed together to unravel in a certain sense. But when you think about the periods of time that I've studied, have often been crisis periods. And there is something, as you know as an historian, where a crisis gives freedom for the leader to do things that might not otherwise happen. Obviously, if Lincoln had been president in the 1830s or 1840s, before the anti-slavery movement had reached its peak as it did before the South seceded, he might not have been able to do what he was able to do. Similarly, if FDR had not come on the scene at the time of the Depression, all of the legislation that was pushed through in that 100 days would have taken a lot longer to get through. So there's something about the crisis creating opportunity, but then you need the person there to be able to diagnose and exploit that opportunity. Herbert Hoover was there before FDR. Buchanan was there before Lincoln. And they didn't make the same things happen. So that's that conjunction of the man and the times. The thing that is so interesting is Lincoln, when he was a young man, was worried that his entire generation didn't have any great challenges. That, what are we going to do? He said we might have become a congressman without much purpose. We might go after money. But the founding fathers have done everything. They've created the whole thing, and nothing's left for us. That wasn't true.
And what about the period of your most recent book, at the beginning of the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt? That's less understood. We all have a sense of TR and a fascination with him, but the bigger context and the degree to which the country was deeply divided and his part in the midst of that, and then ultimately how it resolved somehow. But are there reasonable comparisons between that period of time and today?
Well, sometimes when you hear the context of the turn of the 20th century, the rising gap between the rich and the poor, corporations having lots of power, people feeling like the middle class was squeezed, new technology making people... It was great. At the turn of the century, they worried about the speed of modern life, that somehow people were getting depressed because things had gotten too fast. And then I think about, my God, what about today? But the interesting thing is Teddy Roosevelt's one of the few presidents who is considered a great president, and he didn't have that extant crisis, but he saw the hidden dangers of that era in which he was living, where there was no workman's compensation, women and children were being exploited, and he was able to mobilize public sentiment. That's where the whole word bully pulpit came. It was his definition that the president has a power to preach to the country, and then the country can force or encourage the Congress to move. And he did actually do things that most people agreed upon, but it had just gotten stuck in the Congress being divided at that time.
At a time when the president said much less, and there was so much less access to a president, they seemed to have so much more power in the words that they did say.
The great presidents, in a certain sense, were lucky to be in a time when their own strengths were right there. Think about it. I mean, Lincoln is a man of the word, a written word. And at that time, speeches would be published in full in the newspapers. They'd be pamphletized. People would be reading those extraordinary words over and over again and reading them aloud, even to people in the neighborhood. Teddy Roosevelt comes on when the mass market newspapers have just come into being, and he has that short, punchy language, speak softly and carry a big stick. He even gave Maxwell House the slogan, good to the very last drop. It is said that he drunk 40 cups of coffee a day, but so there was something to that energy he had, right? But he knew how to capture headlines. He knew how to have colorful language, to be a fighting spirit. FDR comes along and has the perfect voice, that conversational voice for the radio. Reagan comes along and JFK, and they're perfect for television. I just saw something the other day about FDR. I read about a construction worker talking, I have to get home tonight. And they said, why? And he said, well, FDR is coming into my living room to speak to me. I've got to be there. So that was the power that, you're right, they didn't speak as often then. It wasn't 24 cable news. They weren't overexposed. In fact, FDR was asked at one point, he only had 30 fireside chats. He said less is more, that if I'm on the radio too often, my speeches will become routine and they will lose their effectiveness.
And has that happened in the modern time? I mean, you've watched President Obama pretty closely and have something of a relationship there. Have we heard too much from him, even though he is a very charismatic person in person?
I think the problem now, the bully pulpit, is less powerful than it once was. Not only do we hear too much, perhaps, and we see them too often, so their words don't have that special moment, but even when they give a major speech now, at least it used to be covered by 3 networks, and everybody pretty much would be watching it. Now you might be watching your favorite cable network. You'll only hear the part that they want you to hear. You may not hear the whole speech. You might hear the pundits, sometimes including myself, criticizing it before it's even done. I remember after President Obama was elected the second time, and he did really try to have a dialogue on gun control, and it showed that a majority of the people agreed with the small measures that were being taken on background checks. But somehow that dialogue began. He was on television a few times. He went a few places with the people who were hurt in some of those incidents. But the next thing you know, we were thinking about something else. You know, we worry about Russia one minute, and the next minute it's Ebola, you know, and then it's the CIA report. And it's a larger problem of attention span for people today. I mean, when you think about the internet, you think about email, you think about blogging, I wonder that anybody can focus on anything long enough. I think something's happening to our brain. That's why it's so nice to go back to history and just remember those days when people wrote letters, you know, for 10 hours, you know, at night. My guys would write to their wives, you know, for 10 pages, 20 pages, and just that freedom and the leisure of thinking when you're writing a letter, as opposed to writing an email right now in the staccato form that it might be.
What's that going to do to historians of the future?
I don't know. I mean, I think 200 years from now, historians will know much more about us in a certain way. They'll see how we walked and talked. I mean, when we were working on the Lincoln movie, we only knew that Lincoln walked like a laborer coming home at the end of a hard day. We'd never seen him walking, but somebody said that in a note or in a memoir, in a diary. We knew how he spoke because somebody described it. But yet, what they won't have 200 years from now is the intimate emotional detail, like when Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, was writing to his wife because she wasn't in Washington, talking about, I hope we're seeing the same moon tonight, and I'm thinking of you, and I love you, and I miss you. But more than that, he's talking about what Lincoln did that day, what all the cabinet guys did. He's talking about which ones he's mad at. Nobody's taking the time to write diaries. I mean, they're afraid of diaries now because something can happen to them legally, or to write letters. And even if it's email, it's normally not that intimate detail that we had. So I'm always going to go back in time. I don't think I could ever write about a current person.
So speaking of Obama, he came into office really caught up in Lincoln stuff and repeated a lot of the sort of ritual, what now might be perceived as Lincoln rituals, embraced all that, loves the book Team of Rivals, asked you to organize some dinners for him at the White House, so I take it you've had some dialogue with him. But how do you rate him in terms of someone who set out to try to make use of the political genius of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, it's interesting to think that one of the things he wanted to do at the beginning was to create a team of rivals, because he thought that Lincoln was smart to surround himself with people who could argue with him. And I think most famously, right after he won the nomination, somebody said, would you really be willing, like Lincoln did, to put somebody into your inner circle, even if his or her spouse were an occasional pain in the butt, who was a chief rival, of course, thinking of Hillary Clinton? And he then went right back and quoted Lincoln saying, I want the strongest, most able people in the country. Yes, I would. And when he put her in as Secretary of State, it seemed like, yes, he was going to make a team of rivals. He had kept the Republicans Secretary of Defense. He tried to bring in Judd Gregg from New Hampshire. I think the problem is now that it's harder to get people from the other party to accept, sometimes in positions of foreign affairs, to be part of your cabinet, because the division between the parties has become so strong that there seemed like traitor if you go to the other side. I mean, when FDR brought in Stimson and Knox, two top Republicans, to his cabinet on the eve of World War II, it was an extraordinarily good thing to do, because he got arguments about things. They had different points of view, and even they were considered traitors at the time, but the war allowed them cover to do it. So I think it's harder to govern today in both the bully pulpit sense that we talked about earlier and in really creating a team of rivals. And especially when you think about these guys in the team of rivals were writing these horrible things about one another in their diaries. If that came out today, the way they talked about each other in our modern press, the whole thing would blow apart. One
of the most intriguing, powerful of the Oval Office recordings that were captured, in this case with President Kennedy. One of the ones that I find most interesting is at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you're able to hear Kennedy getting input from this wide range of people around him, many of whom are in strong disagreement to his position and other people in the room. At one point he stops and calls President Eisenhower and tries to get advice from him. The thing most powerful about that for me is that in the end, particularly 50 years later, now that we really know so much more about what was happening in all directions, was that effectively everyone in the room was wrong. all of the advice President Kennedy was getting was wrong. And the only person who was even close was, in fact, Eisenhower, going on gut judgment. But then in the end, President Kennedy was willing to make a decision that actually broke with almost everyone in the room that turned out to be precisely the right thing. So it wasn't so much that he was getting the perfect advice, but this process of consideration.
And I think what had happened, though, the mistakes that he made in the Bay of Pigs, he learned from. I mean, if you make a mistake, failure can be a great tool for you. And I think he learned not to rely on expert advice. He saw what had happened when he did that with the Bay of Pigs. So that was an incredible moment for him, I think, when he got to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a larger figure, having learned from that earlier failure. I mean, these tapes are still such great tools. I mean, the LBJ tapes are just without comparison. I love listening to those. I'll never forget once when I was talking to a man, Don Kendall, who ran Pepsi-Cola, and he knew LBJ. So he told me that when he first went down to the ranch, LBJ asked him to come visit him about something because Nixon was becoming president and wanted to have this guy Kendall talk to LBJ about some controversial matter. So I said, I get to the ranch, Johnson's working on his memoirs. He says, oh, these memoirs, I'm not having any good time with them at all. The only ones that are any good are where I had this little taping machine in my Oval Office. I used to press a button and I have verbatim conversations. Those chapters are coming out great. So you go back and tell your good friend Nixon as he starts his presidency, there's nothing more important than a taping system.
Perhaps President Johnson actually had something nefarious planned there. Perhaps he saw into the soul of President Nixon better than the rest of us. It could well be the case. In terms of President Obama and the Lincoln comparison, not to overdraw it, but the other thing that strikes me as worth observing as a historical comparison is the fixation that we have today on the popularity of presidents, the sort of moment-by-moment popularity. I mean, you know this, we all know this to some degree, but Lincoln was elected in 1860 with 39% of the vote, I think. I mean, that makes President Obama's approval ratings today look pretty good compared to Abraham Lincoln. And yet we have the sense that because there is dissatisfaction, that's the definition of a failing president. And the same was applied to President Bush at the end of his tenure. But has that distorted in ways that are not constructive the way that we perceive our presidents, their ability to lead?
I think it probably has. I mean, I think those continuing public opinion polls, level of satisfaction, is the guy doing a good job on the economy? Is he doing a good job on foreign affairs? And it does then become a common conversation about the president as if he's losing power, even if you can't translate those public opinion polls into power. The only reason public sentiment matters, and it does matter. I mean, Lincoln said, with public sentiment, everything is possible. Without it, nothing is. So public sentiment matters, but that's different from public opinion poll. It's how the people are feeling about issues at the time and how you can mobilize them to get changes in the country that you want to have and how you can influence Congress with them. But I think we have become much too concerned. And I think presidents even today, they not only worry about their popularity, but they also worry about their legacy the minute they get in there. You know, it's become a little bit too much. You feel that they're looking at all the pictures on the wall. Where am I going to stand with these guys? Time will take care of that for them. They better just govern as they are right now.
And we have a journalism today that encourages all of this, that perceives the day-to-day events of the White House and of every president as essentially a horse race, and almost as if there's a new election every day. The media, I think, even though I'm sort of part of it, encourages this idea, partly for theatrical, dramatic purposes. But so where does the media fit into, and specifically the people who cover the White House and the president?
Well, you know, the thing that makes me sad after just having lived for 7 years with Teddy and Taft, I mean, I do feel I live with these guys after a while. I wake up with them in the morning. I think about them when I go to bed at night.
Is your husband jealous of them?
Well, he thinks these are pretty great guys to be sharing me with, so it's okay. But I think about the media during the Progressive era, for example, and what an extraordinarily positive role they played. Ida Tarbell and Ray Baker were given 2 years of research time to come up with their huge monumental series on Standard Oil or on the railroad abuses. And those series mobilized public opinion. They helped Teddy Roosevelt to get the good legislation that most people now would look back on was right to be passed. Where would that happen today? Where would somebody in journalism be given 2 years to research without writing a single word? Who would be reading the pieces that they've written? They were 30,000 word pieces, and people were gobbling them up in these magazines. We wouldn't take the time to do that now. And I worry that what used to be investigative reporting has now become entertainment reporting, and that there's such a need for swiftness on the part of journalists. They're trying to beat the other guys especially with the internet, that the depth of reporting that we need, it's still going on. Obviously, there are pieces of it out there, but I'm not sure if you're a young journalist today that that's what's being rewarded in the same way it certainly was back then.
And instead, this focus on the personalities of presidents themselves and the people around them. Another aspect of your writing consistently, and I think really you probably played as large a role as any other writer or historian in terms of advancing the idea that understanding an important figure in history is about much more than just them, or the policies that they adopted, or the things that they did, but the spouse, the children, the larger contact, the spouses and children of the other rivals, the other people who were there. And your books have been these rich social fabric histories around these figures. Yet, when we look at our contemporary leaders, there's really almost none of that. And in fact, and if there's anything, it's only snarky stuff on the margins. But we perceive these presidents in really narrow ways that perhaps don't really get at the things that you end up spending years of time trying to figure out.
You know, I hadn't really thought of that until you answered the question, until you asked the question. But I think that's right. I mean, I think when I think about what's combined all the books that I've written together, it's the importance of relationships. And you think about it in our own lives. That's key. It's not just wife and friends, but colleagues, the people you're working with. How do you form a team? So that in a certain sense, Lincoln's was a team that he was able to form out of these people who had all thought they should have been president instead of him, who looked down on him at the start and realized in the end that he was, in a certain sense, the chief of them all. FDR's relationship with Eleanor. Without Eleanor, he would not have been the president that he was. I mean, she was the moral figure, constantly arguing with him, constantly, being a pain, as he might say, but a great pain, and a thorn in his side. I guess that's the way he put it. And obviously, Teddy without Taft wouldn't have been the same, and Taft without Teddy. So that these people don't govern in isolation, and yet we do somehow, you're right, in the time when we look at them, we just see the guy in the White House. So far, just the guy in the White House. And they care about the wives, et cetera, and there's something on the kids. But what's more important is what kind of collegial relationships do they have with the people they're working with? We don't know a lot about that. And that teams thing is critical in business, in any organization, that I'd like to know more about, even at the time.
In terms of President Obama and these antecedents that may exist in history, it seems to me the conventional wisdom is that the team of rivals approach, while it's where he started, that it hasn't really played out the way that he might have imagined. In fact, it tends to be that the criticism of him oftentimes is more along the lines of being a micromanager, and then progressively more of one over the course of his presidency. At the same time, one of the things that you capture so well in Team of Rivals is that Lincoln wasn't just engaged in these relationships with the designated rivals, but he was orchestrating a much larger symphony. I mean, the degree to which he was reaching down to individual generals and individual people.
No, I do think that most of our successful presidents have had to reach below the cabinet level to get to that desk officer, in the State Department, or to get to the general below the general at that certain level. The other interesting thing your question reminds me of, though, is I think in these earlier days, our presidents were able to reach out to the public and absorb their feelings and their ideas in a deeper way. I mean, for example, Teddy Roosevelt went on these whistle-stop train tours. He'd be gone 6 weeks in the spring and 6 weeks in the fall, stopping at every station, listening to complaints, listening to what the people were feeling, even waving to them as he was going past them, and they were standing at little village stations. There's one moment when he was waving frantically, and he was kind of disappointed that he didn't seem to get a smile back until somebody told him he was waving at a herd of cows. He was rather nearsighted. But anyway, there was a sense in which you wish that our presidents today, they get stuck in Washington. They do go out for fundraisers, obviously. They go out and they have meetings with people, town halls. It's not the same as the everyday process where Lincoln saw ordinary people every morning. At that day before civil service, they came in and they wanted a job. And after a while, his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, said, "Lincoln, you don't have time for these ordinary people." He said, "You're wrong." This is the popular assemblage out of which I have come. I must never forget that. These are my public opinion baths. And so there was a sense of constant connection to ordinary people. So too did the train trips that Teddy Roosevelt went on. And FDR was constantly having people into the White House all the time. No dinner without people that he could talk to, that could argue with him. You don't have the feeling that our modern presidents have moved outside the White House as much as these people did to really get a feeling for where the country's at.
And what have these dinners been that you have organized at the White House?
Well, the idea that President Obama had was that he wanted to meet with historians who would come with their presidents in their heads. We don't come dressed up as Truman or Jackson. But there are actually at the plates sometimes little plates from the past that are part of the dinner thing, and give him advice from our guys. So he's had one of these a year just about, and they're off the record. And they've been fun. I mean, they've been fun for us historians. And I think they've been fun for him, too. Because so there'll be modern problems, and it's not going to be discussed publicly, but then you'd say, well, this is what Teddy might have done, or this is what Truman might have done. And for us, it's great to be there. And there's nothing, no matter how many times you've been in the White House, it's still a thrill every single time you go in, I must say.
When I say to a historian, how might Teddy Roosevelt have handled this, or what's the lesson from that thing in the past to deal with this thing in the present, and very oftentimes the historian will say, well, actually, I'm about the things in the past, and even the notion of lessons of history is disputed by people at times. Then, on the other hand, we have events like this where a president really wants to hear about history, and historians like you who are game to draw these parallels.
I'm actually thinking about this a lot right now because the work I'm doing is a book on leadership. I'm going to bring all my guys into the room at the same time and try and figure out, are there things we can learn from their leadership, even though the context was different? And obviously you have to set the context for each person because that changes the nature of the challenges that they've met, but they're all dealing with human nature. Leadership is about mobilizing people, it's about persuading people, it's about getting through obstacles. So there's no question in my mind that there are lessons to be learned from people who were leaders in the past, or otherwise we're just assuming that history can't teach us anything. And what are we doing otherwise?
What's the point if there aren't any lessons of history, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's crazy. I mean, I know people say that, but that's, sometimes we academics, or I used to be an academic, get pretty stuffy, and I think that's a stuffy response if somebody says that.
Let's talk about you as a writer for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to some speculative history after that. But how did you become you?
Oh, a minor question, sir. I don't think I've ever been asked that in my life. I mean, I think if that means how did I come to love history, I mean, it partly has to do, there's no question, as I always come back to my father teaching me how to keep score when I was a little girl so that I could record for him the history of that Brooklyn Dodgers game. And, I think I learned the narrative art from those nicely sessions with my father, because at first I'd blurt out, after I had learned these miniaturized symbols, it was going to take 2 hours to tell him the story. The Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost, which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Much later, read an essay by my heroine, Barbara Tuchman, who said, even if you're writing about a war, you have to imagine you do not know how that war ended, so you can carry a reader with you every step along the way, just knowing what the people at the time knew. So that's where that love of history came, even if it was just the history of the Dodger game 3 hours before. And then I had a teacher in high school, as is so often the truth, Miss Austin, and she won an award as the best history teacher in New York State. And then I went to some of the homes. My parents took me to FDR's home. I think there's nothing like seeing the homes of these people to feel like they're still alive. I remember when I was little seeing FDR's glasses on his desk and seeing his cigarette holder. And I said to this tour person, he's got to be alive. He left his glasses here. And then seeing Fowler's leash on the bed upstairs and thinking the little dog was still running around. And then I began to think, you could really write history as if they are still alive. My only fear is that someday there'll be a panel of all these presidents I've ever studied in the afterlife, and they'll all be telling me every single thing I got wrong. And the first person to scream out will be LBJ. How come that book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But speaking of LBJ, how I became what I became, there's no question that experience of being a White House fellow when I was 24 years old, working with LBJ, being with him on the ranch to help him on his memoirs, listening to him talk, having hours with him that I would never have had as a young person is what turned me into a presidential scholar. My PhD was in Supreme Court history. I might have been a Supreme Court historian, which would have been fine, but probably not as much fun as this has been.
It's so interesting, two of the things you said, particularly the last one, that time as a White House fellow. I'm struck often these days by, there is a perception in society now, particularly that young people, I think, absorb, and I begin to sound like an old man when you start saying young people, but it's interesting to me the way, how difficult it is for many people to embrace that something is important. You know, there's just sort of there's a reluctance to take something really seriously. Even the visit of a presidential candidate, or why a Senate race is really important, or that principles really matter. It seems that it's harder and harder for young people to grab on to that there's really something consequential about what happens at the White House. And obviously that experience that infused you with that sense of that this stuff really, really matters.
But you know, the interesting thing is, when I was a young person, I probably didn't realize it as much at that moment. I remember sometimes when LBJ would want me to talk to him at night because he'd be lonely, and I had a date, and I'm thinking, oh, do I really want to talk to this guy at night instead of going out on a date? And I think, thank God, most of the time I said, yes, I will. But you know, your perspective is somewhat undone at that time. You know, it was really later that I realized what a privilege it was, because he was vulnerable in those last years of his life. He knew that the war in Vietnam had cut his legacy in two, but he knew what he had accomplished in civil rights. We're getting it now. I mean, that's the thing that makes me sad. If only he had lived long enough to see 50 years later that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and Medicare, I mean, he left his stamp on the country. But at that time, he was so sad that he spent hours talking to me that he never would have if I'd known him at the height of his power. So I just happened to be there, luckily. And it was perhaps that I was a young woman. It was perhaps that I was loving history. Whatever it was that allowed him to choose me to spend so many hours with. Sometimes I think it was just because I loved listening to his stories, you know, and they were so incredibly interesting, even if I discovered later that half of them weren't true. So I think part of it was that he liked the fact that I liked listening to his tall tales. I also worried that part of it was that I was a young woman, but and one day he took me to the lake saying he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous because the lake was called Lake Lyndon Johnson, and we had wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic traffic, and I thought, oh my God, here it comes. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I've ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind.
Suddenly you realize you actually kind of did want him to be interested in you.
Right. I mean, this was terrible.
How dare you? The other really incisive thing that I think you've just been talking about is your recognition of the importance of story, particularly for historians, I think. And but not just that. What you have done is to recognize that story is so central, because without story, nobody really cares, or nobody really understands it, or nobody stays around long enough to make sense of it all. But you bring this powerful narrative device into all of your work, but then attached to that, this incredibly granular level of scholarship. I think I counted 5,500 footnotes in Team of Rivals. That's about right, isn't it?
I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
That's why they're so fat.
Exactly.
Somebody told me they were reading Bully Pulpit, and they were very nice, saying they liked it very much, but they were reading it when they went to sleep at night, and it fell on their nose and broke her nose. So there's a problem.
So now you've got an OSHA claim against you. Why is it so important that you not tell the end of the story, even though everybody knows the end of the story? Why do you have to hold that back while you're writing these many hundreds of pages?
Because what you're really hoping is to catapult the reader back into this time that you have now spent years absorbing. And that means that they have to be with the people learning only what they're knowing at the time. If you constantly tell them what we already know and it drags them out of that moment, they're not living with the person. I mean, the real hope is that when Lincoln dies, people will feel sad. I mean, the nicest thing people have ever told me is they didn't want to finish the book because they knew he was going to die. And I feel that way too. When I'm reaching near the end of the book, I get sad because I know I'm not going to be living with this person anymore. And each time I move from one person to another, I feel like I'm betraying the one from the past. I have to move his books out of the room to make room for the next one. And I think I'm being disloyal.
In trying to pull together these narratives as a writer and a historian, how did you deal with that, particularly in the case of Lincoln, but this would apply also to Roosevelt and certainly and to FDR too, but how did you deal with that, these figures who've been so mythologized, particularly Lincoln, and it's not just splitting rails and reading a book by the firelight in a log cabin, but so much more than that. And your book does have all sorts of accounts. It's part of the beauty of it, these little bitty encounters. And the exchange between Lincoln, I don't know why I remember this particular one, but the exchange between Lincoln and a teamster who's cursing, and him saying, "What church are you, an Episcopalian?" And well, you must be because you curse like
Seward.
you
Exactly,
curse like Seward.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, this little tiny account that, of course, there's really no way to find 4 cross references to that moment in time. I didn't look up the footnote, or at least didn't today. But but presumably that came from some account that. But how do you, particularly from an era in which people did make up all sorts of things, and newspapers had no real burden of being correct, and we're all partisan. How did you sift through all that?
Yeah, and with Lincoln, it's particularly hard. In fact, there's been a book written about judging the various stories on Lincoln by 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, depending on whether somebody told it at the time, depending on whether it was written down, depending on whether it was told to a 4th person or a 5th person. And you do have to think about those things. And sometimes you say, this story, may be exaggerated, but then if it's such a good story, you want to tell it. So then you, in the footnote, will say, we're not quite, no, I don't quite do that. But I think in the end, it's judgment. It's the question of whether does that story sound, forgetting the one we just talked about, which may or may not be true, but that was Seward saying that at the time, so that makes sense. But forgetting all of that sort of stuff, you have to make a judgment. Does this story tell me something about the character that I think I've gotten to know? Because in the end, what you're really doing is telling the reader about these people with their strengths, with their weaknesses, as you've come to feel them, as you've come to know them. And the stories help to fill that out. And if the story helps to do that, then you use it. If it doesn't, if it seems like it's odd, and sometimes and then you just say, okay, I'm not going to tell that story. We tell a story, and then you find yourself sometimes you tell a story, and then you remember some other little part about it, and then it makes it more interesting the next time. And that's why, LBJ used to tell a story about his great-great-grandfather dying at the Battle of the Alamo, and it was so stirring until somebody pointed out he didn't have a great-great-grandfather who died at the Alamo. He just wished he did so much, he must have made him up in his mind. So then you think, oh my God, what are we going to do with this?
And also, I think you skillfully apply another art which is often lost, particularly in journalism today, but just whether the internal logic of an anecdote stands up. And that if this is true, then what else must be true? And are those things, is there evidence of those things? Or factoring in what would be the motivation of a person to have told this story or remembered this thing, and who's believable and who's not. Right. The county sheriff's account of why he arrested a lot of African American people in 1900 is probably not the most reliable account, even if we are missing the accounts from the other side.
Absolutely.
That sort of logic. Let's go back to talking about leaders. And some of this work that you're doing now, and the notion of whether the nature versus nurture argument about great leaders. I mean, was Abraham Lincoln born destined to be this spectacular figure, or was it those long nights reading the book in the light of the fire?
Well, I think thinking of Lincoln, it's really interesting because obviously there are traits that he's born with. Intelligence, with that artistic capacity, is probably an inborn trait. And what he's born with is ambition. This is the mystery. I'd love to know the answer to this. Where do we get our ambition from? Where is that drive? In Lincoln, it was huge. It was fierce. I mean, he's in this poor situation where he is. Most of the people don't read or write around him, and he's teaching himself to read. And then he becomes the only one in that community that can read, and that sets him above everybody else and makes him feel like maybe I have a chance to get out of this community. And then he desperately wants to get out, and he wants to become somebody. And he dreams even of making a difference in people's lives when he's a young man, before he has any chance of thinking, I can really do it. And even at the moment when he's in his early 30s and he's in a depression, and a suicidal depression, and his friends come to him and they take all knives and scissors away. And partly the depression is that the gap between those huge ambitions and where he is in his life seems like, I'll never get there. And they say, you have to rally or you'll die. And he said, I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet done anything to make any human being remember that I have lived. That's my dream. He tells that to his friend Joshua Speed at the time. And then years later, when he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, Speed comes to the White House. He said, well, finally, I think my dream has been realized. So where does that come from, that mysterious desire and drive that you want something in your life and you have the perseverance? Almost all my guys have identified themselves early as a leader somehow. Even Teddy, when he's with his family, he's the one who's telling stories to his siblings, even as an asthmatic kid. He's the one who's leading them in games. But then usually something happens to test them, some adversity. I mean, Lincoln's whole life was filled with adversity. Teddy loses his wife and goes out to the Badlands and becomes a different person in a certain sense. FDR has polio and becomes a different person. So there are things that you can see that have formed them, but in some ways it's still going to be a mystery as to why somebody drives themselves to want to become one of these characters.
And how do you see any of our contemporary presidents in that same regard?
Well, you know, I think that the question today is what it takes to run for the presidency may be different than what it takes to govern us now. I mean, it takes a certain understanding of the tactical skills of campaigning. It takes understanding caucuses, understanding how to raise funds, how to get money. And that drives a person. And then once they get there, are they still dreaming the same dreams that a Lincoln had? Maybe they are, but I think it's much harder to achieve those dreams. When we look at our recent presidents, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but again, I'm going to go back to that optimism of earlier on. Just because things seem tough right now and it seems like nobody can get anything done in Congress and they can't agree with one another, and who would ever want to be a congressman or a senator today when they're not accomplishing something they can possibly tell their grandchildren, I was there when that civil rights bill passed, and yet this fever will break. Something's going to happen. I got to believe that the country will start dealing with its problems again, as we have before. Somebody said to FDR once, why would anyone want to be president with all these horrible decisions you have to make? He said, what? Why would everybody should want to be president? It's the greatest job in the world. You know, and Teddy Roosevelt so loved being in the center of attention that his daughter Alice said he wanted to be the baby at the baptism and the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. But still, I think maybe, I haven't seen recent presidents since Clinton, that you've seen a real joy in the process of being president, that natural politician thing. People feel that, and they want that in their leader, I think.
And why do you think it is that, for instance, say with President Obama, that here you have a figure that is elected in a fairly resounding way originally, what does indeed appear to be a tremendous mandate, all sorts of people voting for him who were not logical to have voted for him at that particular moment in time, great sense of national accomplishment around this that was somewhat distinct from him, I think, but that day on the Mall, the day of the inauguration, you know, there's 1 million people out there. And yet, in just like what seemed to be the blink of an eye, this was a president who was in distress and under attack, even sort of before anything had happened. I mean, does that say something about the schizophrenic quality of the American people? And is that a new thing, if that's the case?
Well, there certainly was. I think you're right. And you've probably thought about this more than I, but there was a sense that America felt good about itself in electing its first African American president, as I hope someday they'll feel good about themselves electing their first woman president. So that there was a sense in which this was an accomplishment in itself. And maybe it was apart from Obama and how, as you suggest in your question, how they actually felt about this person, although this person did seem to be somebody on whom we could all project a liking during that campaign and a feeling good about ourselves, that we had moved beyond some of our racial prejudices. Probably those prejudices still remain, as we've seen in these last years, and they're going to take a lot more time and energy to still come to the surface and be dealt with. And the election itself didn't do what we might have hoped it would have done in terms of ending that racial divide, as we're seeing so sadly right now. So it's a complicated question, but I think there will be, when history looks back, the fact that the first African American was elected will be a moment in history, no matter what, and a good moment.
How do you react to the oft-made assertion that that things are more toxic in our politics today than ever, that it's nastier and dirtier and crueler than at any point in the past? And I'll cut you off first. Almost every historian first gravitates to you're forgetting the election of 1800 and bad, nasty things Thomas Jefferson said about da-da-da-da-da. But skipping past that, but in a broader sort of way, how do we compare in terms of the level of acid in our national discourse compared to past times?
I'll tell you, I think in my lifetime, I won't go back to the revolvers on the floor in the Senate in the 1850s, because I agree with what you're saying. In my lifetime, it's more toxic than I've seen it, and I think there are some reasons for that. I mean, even during LBJ's time, so we're talking 50 years ago, the congressmen and senators used to stay in Washington on the weekends. They weren't racing home to get funds for their campaigns, for these increasingly escalating costs of campaigns, which I still think is the poison in the system today. They formed friendships across party lines. They played poker together. They drank together. So when Johnson needed to get Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, to go with him on civil rights, they had a friendship that he could build upon. Things weren't as transparent then. He could offer him all sorts of things, dams, public works projects, bridges. That would be impossible today, right? And he could also offer him, more importantly, Everett, you come with me on this bill, you bring some Republicans to break the Southern filibuster, and 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? But there was a camaraderie, there was a sense of institutional patriotism. There was a sense in which they felt, they in Congress and in the Senate, this is where we are. Now they all want to run for president. They can't wait to get out of where they are. They're spending so much time raising funds. They have those structural problems with redistricting where they don't have to be moderate, and the cable networks doesn't help, and people are on the television if they're more extreme. The way the primary system is run produces that extremity. I think it's worse now than in my lifetime, but you're right, it's not as bad maybe as 1800 or 1850s.
I have the sense that in 1800 or maybe in 1850, but not in 1820, that you didn't have the level of personal vituperative sensibility.
I agree with you. No, I think there is a sense now that there doesn't seem to be the same dignity of feeling we are fellow colleagues. In fact, even in the 19th century, if you said something really bad toward one of your fellow colleagues, you could get censured. Now they'd all be censured. I mean, the kinds of things they say about each other. I just don't, again, going back to the idea that sounds so light, but I think is real, of enjoying the job, I can't imagine that the congressmen and senators today love being congressmen and senators because they don't have that colleagueship that really was important in the old days. And something, again, is going to have to break that.
Each of your key figures are also ones whose legacies were not completely clear at the time of their deaths, actually. And in particular with both Lincoln, FDR, and Kennedy, each of them is abbreviated while still a figure on the stage, and someone who was expected to do something else tomorrow on the day that they disappear. And so in the end, that also means that they did not have to confront that things didn't always turn out the way that they perhaps were expecting them. As we said earlier, Lincoln didn't have to confront that, what to do with all of these emancipated people. Right. What's the real, we still, I think, maybe you would say differently, we're still not entirely clear what Lincoln really imagined the lives of African Americans would be as free people. FDR didn't have to wrestle with particularly the actions of the 30s and how they have now, that we're still arguing about the degree that government should be involved in some of the things they brought it into. And then Kennedy on civil rights in Vietnam was tragically, but was absolved of having to reckon with those things. How does that affect the way that you evaluate the greatness of those individuals?
No, there's no question that being cut short before the ending makes a huge difference. My husband, who was in the JFK administration and worked for LBJ as well, was one time trying to give solace to Bobby Kennedy, who was worried that his brother had only had 3 years, and it just wasn't fair, that history wasn't going to give him a good shake because he hadn't had the right time to do things. And my husband, trying to make him feel better, said, well, Julius Caesar only had 3 years, and he's okay. And so then Bobby said, well, it helps to have Shakespeare write about you. So, I mean, as far as Lincoln goes, and you had this question earlier, I mean, he understood himself, I think, that the problem of Reconstruction was going to be even more complicated, more challenging than the problem of winning the war had been. And it was going to take incredible statesmanship and probably would be the most difficult thing he'd ever have to do. So you're right, he gets cut down at that moment. We can imagine that he would have made things possible for Black Americans while still keeping the South in the Union without all the bitterness that eventually happened. That may not have happened. It might have tarnished his legacy had he lived longer, without a question, because we can imagine now that he would have done all the things we hope that some mythical person would have done. But I still think the country would have been far better off having Lincoln there to deal with the South than possibly Andrew Johnson or anybody else who came after him. So it would have been worth that legacy being touched to some extent if we could have had that person there at the time.
If you were having dinner with President Obama next week and he said, Doris, give me 3 bullet points, 4 bullet points, what do I do the next 2 years so that the you of 20, 30, 40 years from now looks back on me in a good way? What would your advice to him be?
Well, I think one of the things is to not lose energy. I mean, one of the things LBJ told his staff in those last couple of years is, I don't want to see a single resume on anybody's desk. I don't want you thinking of where you're going. We still got time. So I think the most important thing is to not feel that constriction of time, which I think you begin to feel when you see everybody else turning their attention to the next campaign. There's still time for foreign affairs. There's time for domestic stuff. There's time for thinking about climate, which he is talking about. There's time to deal with this racial issue. Who is better adept, possibly, at dealing with it, which has reared its head yet once again. So I think that the important thing is to just keep your energy going and think about what you came into the presidency for in the first place. What were the things you hoped to accomplish? The economy is now seeming to get better, but maybe not still for the people who are struggling with 2 careers and wife and husband working at the same time, and what's happening to the middle class, and what's happening with the gap between the rich and the poor. That doesn't bother me as much as mobility. I think mobility in our country is a huge problem because we were founded on the thought that if you were born in a certain place, you could move upward with perseverance and hard work. When I see that people who are born in the lower quintile never usually make it out of there, or very rarely do, less now than in Europe, less than in the past, that's something that I think our president should worry about.
You said a moment ago that President Obama, having been the first Black president, on that basis alone, I think what you said was that's an important thing, no matter what. That's going to be an important thing. His advocates would say first Black president, passage of national health care legislation after 50 years of discussion about it, that just on the basis of those 2 things, I think you could also throw in that what were probably the right decisions at the very beginning of his presidency, along with President Bush, in terms of the financial crisis. His advocates would say, once all of the noise has settled away, that adds up to a great presidency, despite all the other things.
I think it will look more consequential in the future than it does now. And that's partly because of what you said before. We're just so in the middle of criticizing perhaps what we feel about his leadership, or the things that we wish were different about him, or his relationship with the press, or his inability to get Congress to do something. And it'll be 30 years from now that they'll look back and see what actually happened during that period of 8 years. And more probably did happen than we might be feeling right now, because it seems like the recession may have come to an end, or maybe coming out of it. So maybe the stimulus did do something at the beginning, or some of those decisions that were made. Healthcare did get passed. It'll be important to see whether it sustains itself. If it got repealed, that would make a huge difference to his legacy. But if it becomes something like Medicare, then he will be given credit for that, and being the first African American president. Yeah, I think we're really hard pressed to evaluate these people in the middle of them all right now. Maybe we could never have. Look, if FDR hadn't run for a 3rd term and he had been stopped in 1939, 1940, he would have been the president who didn't end the Depression, right? And instead, now he gets that second chance, just what we've been talking about, terrible chance to be the Allied head of World War II, the most terrible war in human history, and yet it gives him a legacy that he would not have had.
A last question, not really a historian's question perhaps, but also with President Obama, we now have the prospect of that this figure, whether he's viewed as great or not, but this first African-American president will leave office and then be around for a really long time, unless he starts smoking again really aggressively. But we're going to have this incredibly historic figure just on the point of being the first black president, and this person who has the allegiance of a group of people who now represent this absolutely essential bloc for one of the political parties. But this person is going to be around probably for 30 years. I don't think we've ever had anything quite like that in terms of an ex-president.
Well, what I wish actually is we tend to have more ex-presidents around nowadays anyway than we ever did before. And I wish they would be called upon more for advice. I mean, it's a special club. They know things, just as you were talking earlier that JFK calls on Eisenhower. And there is somewhat happening with Bush and Clinton having become friends, and they're doing things in philanthropy together. But I don't think we're seeing the current presidents using these characters as much as you would hope they would. So one thing you would hope for the future is that, you know, if he's still around and Clinton's still around, that they can be used more by, well, if Clinton's still around and it's Mrs. Clinton, I guess he'll still be around to give her advice. But being an ex-president is kind of fun these days in a way that it wasn't before. First of all, they have money that they never had in the old days. They can write their books, they can write their memoirs, they can do philanthropy. I suspect that some of these presidents, it looks like President Bush Jr. seems very happy being an ex-president. So who knows what Obama will do? Well, time will tell. This is where we don't know the end of the story yet.
Well, let's hope future presidents listen to you. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Pleasure for me to be with you.
Thanks for being here. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. For more about this book and this program, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. See you next time.